First of all, I need to define some concepts. Physicalism or materialism is the theory that everything in existence is composed of matter and subject to material processes or effects. Mind-body dualism is the theory that there are two basic kinds of things, the mind or psyche and matter. Non-dualism, in comparison, is the theory that there is no distinction between the physical and non-physical. These three theories or concepts all fall into the category of philosophy. Science is descriptive, meaning it describes how the mechanisms of the universe work. Philosophy is mostly interpretive in that it exists to help us understand the universe around us. Philosophy gives us different frameworks and ideas that are useful, but it's ultimately not the right tool to understand how the specific details and mechanics of our world work. I don't have any problem with materialism as a personal belief or as a philosophical framework. You are entitled to hold any views that you like in that area. However, I take issue with the dogmatic idea that the philosophy of materialism is the only view that is truly compatible with science. In order for a theory to be considered scientific, it must be testable, repeatable, and falsifiable, meaning that we must be able to test whether it is false or true. If we can test materialism to see if it's true or false, then it can be considered to be a scientific theory. However, if we begin with the assumption that any experiment which appears to disprove materialism has to be either flawed or fraudulent, then that version of the theory of materialism simply can't be considered scientific. Then, if anyone dismisses scientific evidence superficially on the assumption that it must be flawed or fraudulent, then we can tell from their actions that adhering to the scientific method is a secondary concern compared to upholding their philosophical beliefs about materialism. This is not a straw man argument because I personally talked with someone who is like this. Next, I'm going to talk about Einstein and his comments about quantum entanglement, as they are very revealing. He talks about how he can't make a case for his attitude in physics that others would find reasonable. He states that he can't seriously believe in such a theory because the theory can't be reconciled with the idea that physics should represent a reality in time and space free from spooky actions at a distance. He concludes that he can't base his conviction on logical reasons. This is the nature of personal belief. It doesn't have to be defensible in any logical way or be persuasive to anyone other than yourself. The spooky action at a distance statement labels the quantum entanglement as inherently spooky or paranormal, and therefore it must be unacceptable because it does not abide by the rules of standard classical physics. I want to be specific with my definitions because it's important. The way I see it, there are essentially two definitions for the word paranormal. One is something that exists alongside the normal but exceeds the normal. The second definition is something that can't be explained by science. Dark matter and dark energy have not been completely explained by science, but mainstream scientists would not use the term paranormal to describe either of these things. Not all mysterious things are treated as if they have equal merit by mainstream science due to biases. It's inarguable that scientists can be biased, as Einstein has already demonstrated. The definition of something that is exceeding the normal would also apply to quantum mechanics, as quantum mechanics also exceed the normal rules of classical physics. Some may protest and say that I'm moving the goalposts by defining quantum mechanics as something that exceeds the standard rules and therefore could be considered paranormal. So I asked an AI service whether it is unfair to treat quantum mechanics as something that is substantially different from other observable effects. The answer that the AI gave was that it is, in fact, fair to treat quantum mechanics differently. We can further elaborate on this point by discussing the unpredictability of electron positions. The text I'm showing defines what is natural as something that behaves in a predictable way. In quantum mechanics, the position of electrons is not known until they are measured, and even then we know that measuring a quantum system affects the outcome. If we accept that we must give up the attributes of predictability for an electron's position to be considered natural, then we must also accept that other unpredictable effects can also be considered natural. This will be a problem for some, as it allows unpredictability to be used as an explanation for why some experiments do not yield the desired results. If we classify quantum effects as natural despite their quirks and unpredictability, we must apply the same standard to other effects. This means that if an experiment involves a phenomenon assumed to be paranormal, the inherent unpredictability of the effect could be used to explain why consistent results are not always observable. Mainstream scientists absolutely do not want to accept that they have double standards. Likewise, any experiment that fails to find evidence for the paranormal is viewed as definitive, and any experiment that does find evidence is viewed as either flawed or fraudulent. If the paranormal was held to the same standard that quantum effects are, then scientists would propose that it's likely that there are hidden variables that would explain why not every paranormal experiment has results that prove the existence of the paranormal. This text also talks about how if ghosts are natural entities, then we can study them with the tools of science. This comes from the philosophical position of methodological naturalism. This is a philosophical position and a prescriptive statement about what science should be used for. Likewise, I could hold a personal philosophical position that using science to study the paranormal is more beneficial to society as a whole than the scientific research that is done with the goal of cloning animals. The philosophical position that science shouldn't study the paranormal seems reasonable if one starts out with the scientific definition of the term natural. According to science, anything that interacts with the physical world is natural and not spiritual or supernatural. If we demonstrate that something like a spirit can interact with the physical world, then using the scientific definition of the term natural, the spirit must be natural and not supernatural. Therefore, this definition is not scientific because it is not falsifiable. Any effect that is observed in the natural world by this definition must be natural because we are supposed to be unable to measure or observe non-natural things. It is my personal opinion that the scientific definition of natural is not a useful one. I come to this conclusion because if something is not natural, it can never interact with the physical world and can never be observed. Therefore, the term natural in this usage exists to make a distinction from the non-natural things that would be impossible to observe. The technical term for this sort of idea is called semantic elimination. Science defines natural in such a way that it includes every observable effect in the physical world. So any concept or entity that doesn't have a physical effect, by definition, simply can't be considered natural and therefore is effectively defined out of relevance. The scientific view of the non-natural also involves circular reasoning and the appeal to definition fallacy. It presupposes that the non-natural can't interact with the natural and uses this presupposition to reach the conclusion that any interaction with the natural only can be done by something that is natural. There is no empirical evidence that brings us to the conclusion that the non-natural can't affect the natural, so the scientific view is not at all scientific because it has not been proven with the scientific method. It has not been demonstrated with repeatable, falsifiable, and empirical tests that the non-natural is simply unable to interact with the natural. The scientific view of the matter, then, is not in the realm of science, but in the realm of pseudoscience and dogma, as it is a philosophical belief that is considered to be universally and unquestionably true by almost all scientists. If one uses the scientific method to determine what science can and can't study, then it would be impossible to come to the conclusion that the non-natural can't interact with the natural. If you demonstrated that the two can't interact with the scientific experiment, then you would still prove that science can study the matter. The pseudoscientific view of the non-natural can only be considered to be an impossible and illogical claim. It has been stated that the God of the Gaps belief is a philosophy of ignorance, and this also applies here. The God of the Gaps belief states that anything that science hasn't explained must be evidence of God, and a very similar argument is made with the popular pseudoscience idea that science simply can't study the paranormal. In both cases, the argument hinges on the assumption of some inherent limitation of science, which is just a variation of the appeal to ignorance fallacy. There are several assumptions that mainstream science makes about what is labeled the paranormal, one of which is that there is a lack of empirical evidence, another is that you can't make testable hypotheses about the paranormal, and finally that the paranormal is not bound by natural laws. We can disprove the assumption that there is a lack of empirical evidence and the assumption that we can't make testable hypotheses about the paranormal. There are 16 studies that concern distant healing and intercessory prayer that had adequate double-blind designs and showed significant results that suggest paranormal effects were actually taking place. Now for the assumption that the paranormal is not bound by natural laws. My hypothesis is that the paranormal effects and quantum effects are part of the same overarching phenomena. If my hypothesis is right, then the paranormal is bound by natural laws just like quantum mechanics are. However, I have to remind you that we have the term paranormal for a reason, to distinguish between normal effects and effects that are considered not normal. This distinction did not arise out of any special scientific necessity, but rather because of cultural and linguistic reasons. If we hold quantum mechanics and the paranormal to the same standard of being considered natural effects, then there can be no scientific argument against the paranormal, only arguments based on definitions, philosophy, and linguistics. Such arguments would be sort of legalistic in a way because they don't seek to pursue the truth, but rather obscure it in an attempt to win an argument. There is further evidence that paranormal effects are real and can influence the physical with this scientific experiment. It showed that when someone telepathically sent a thought to another person, there was a measurable EEG result in the mind of the person who was receiving the thought. These people were isolated physically and visually so that the receivers were incapable of knowing with standard physical senses when the sender was sending them such thoughts. Perhaps most importantly, these kinds of tests that involve telepathy have proven to be repeatable. The philosophical and pseudoscientific stance that the paranormal can't interact with the physical, then, is demonstrably wrong. If we theorize that consciousness is a paranormal or non-physical force, then objections to that theory cannot be based on the disproven assumption that paranormal effects can't affect physical things. A brain is a physical thing, so if someone else's thoughts affect the EEG activation in your brain, then that is a physical effect that is caused by the consciousness of someone else. Since the very design of this experiment is based around preventing standard material sensory explanations for this, there can only be non-material or paranormal explanations. We have some research that shows that microtubules in the brain have quantum effects. More specifically, if you give rats a drug that binds to these microtubules, the drug will cause anesthesia to take longer to induce unconsciousness. So we can conclude that what we call consciousness seems to be a quantum process inside the brain, which would mean when you become unconscious, your brain is in a state of quantum decoherence. I apologize, but I can't put all the information on the screen at once without the letters becoming unreasonably small. If we acknowledge that quantum entanglement exists and that consciousness is a quantum process, then we have a specific mechanism that could explain why people continue to have consciousness in a state separate from their body when the body is medically dead. In other words, your consciousness seems to be a non-local effect due to quantum entanglement. This would also explain why remote viewing and telepathy work regardless of the distance involved. Quantum coherence is not just found in human brains, though. It is also found in birds as well as plants' photosynthesis. The quantum vibration found in human brains is likely what causes brainwaves. It was previously thought it was impossible and ridiculous that there could be quantum coherence in the brain. We should always put our biases aside and practice science with an open mind, because if we don't, we will always be blind to the things that we don't want to learn. The part about quantum coherence in plants is particularly important. The Baxter effect is named after Clive Baxter. He noticed that not only was there a galvanic response when a plant's leaf was burned, but when he burned the leaf of a neighboring plant, the original plant responded as if its leaf was also burned. This applies to brine shrimp as well. If brine shrimp in one location die suddenly, then other shrimp in a different location have an instant response that can be recorded by galvanic response equipment. We could then conclude that plants and animals likely are operating with some sort of quantum entanglement mechanism that allows for non-local communication of information. There will inevitably be the response that instant communication of information violates the theory of relativity.